an identity that existed entirely separate from the life she maintained at home. The decision fundamentally divided her existence into two worlds that could never be allowed to meet. During the day, she remained a devoted mother, focused on protecting her children from the realities surrounding their family. She maintained the appearance of ordinary daily life, preserving routines that allowed her children to believe everything remained under control. She never revealed the true nature of her work. Instead, she explained her absences by telling them that she was caring for an elderly woman. That explanation shielded them from a painful truth while allowing her to continue earning the income necessary to support the household. At night, however, Luigia became Antonella. She worked in Genoa's historic district, an area whose narrow streets had long contained a complex mixture of commerce, nightlife, tourism, and marginalized communities. There, she rented a small room located at 64 Vico degli Induratori, using it to meet clients. The room became both her workplace and a symbol of the extraordinary distance between the two lives she was forced to maintain. Every evening required crossing an invisible boundary between motherhood and survival, between the identity known by her family and the identity known by strangers. Such a double life demanded constant vigilance. Every explanation had to remain consistent. Every absence required justification. Every financial improvement needed to appear ordinary. There was no indication that her children suspected the truth. According to investigators, Luigia successfully concealed her secret for years. From the perspective of those closest to her, she was simply a hardworking mother doing everything possible to provide for her family after the death of her husband. The available evidence suggests that her efforts were financially effective. Investigators concluded that she earned enough money through her work to repay portions of the debt, support her children, and maintain the household. The income offered something that conventional employment could not: the possibility of gradually escaping a financial catastrophe that had threatened to destroy her family's future. Yet financial survival carried its own risks. Working in the sex trade exposed Luigia to dangers that extended far beyond individual clients. Investigators later learned that she attracted a relatively large number of customers, a fact that reportedly generated jealousy among other women working in the same area. Competition for clients created tensions that investigators would later consider during the homicide investigation. At the time, however, these tensions were simply another element of the difficult environment in which Luigia worked. Every evening required navigating relationships, rivalries, and uncertainties unfamiliar to the family waiting for her return at home. What makes Luigia's story particularly tragic is the contrast between her motivations and the public assumptions often attached to sex work. According to the available facts, she did not enter that world because of glamour, adventure, or personal ambition. She entered because overwhelming debt left her with few realistic alternatives for supporting two children while facing relentless financial pressure. The available record consistently portrays her actions as an attempt to protect her family from economic collapse. She accepted profound personal sacrifice in exchange for providing stability to those she loved. This perspective does not romanticize or justify the circumstances. Rather, it acknowledges the economic desperation that shaped many of her decisions. Her story illustrates how financial catastrophe can force ordinary individuals into situations they never imagined confronting. It also explains why investigators considered multiple possible motives after her death. Her work inevitably expanded the circle of people who knew her under the name Antonella Weil, leaving her family almost entirely unaware of that hidden identity. Two separate lives meant two separate groups of acquaintances, clients, and potential conflicts. When she was ultimately killed, investigators faced the enormous challenge of reconstructing a world that had remained deliberately concealed from those closest to her. By the summer of 1995, Luigia had maintained this dual existence for approximately 3 years. She continued balancing motherhood with secret nighttime work, apparently believing that she could keep both worlds separate indefinitely. She had survived financial collapse, the loss of her husband, and years of extraordinary pressure from creditors. To those who encountered her at breakfast on the morning of September 5, 1995, she likely appeared no different from any other day. Yet without realizing it, Luigia Borelli was living the final ordinary hours of her life. Within a single day, the carefully maintained balance between her two identities would come to a violent and irreversible end, setting in motion an investigation that would challenge Italian authorities for nearly 3 decades. September 5, 1995, began without any outward sign that it would become the final day of Luigia Borelli's life. Like countless mornings before it, the routines that had defined her carefully balanced existence continued uninterrupted. She was seen having breakfast at a cafe near her home, an ordinary moment that would later acquire extraordinary significance, simply because it became the last confirmed sighting of her alive. Nothing in the available records suggests that she appeared distressed or behaved unusually that morning. There were no documented reports of arguments, visible fear, or conversations hinting that she anticipated danger. To everyone who encountered her, it was simply another day. For investigators looking back months and years later, that ordinary breakfast represented one of the final fixed points in an otherwise fragmented timeline. Beyond that moment, certainty gradually gave way to unanswered questions. After breakfast, Luigia continued with the responsibilities that had become routine since the collapse of her family's finances years earlier. She remained both a mother and the sole provider for her household, carrying the weight of obligations that few people around her fully understood. Behind the appearance of a normal daily life existed the carefully protected secret that had shaped nearly every decision she made since 1992. Her children still believed she spent long hours caring for an elderly woman. They did not know that each evening required her to assume another identity, one created not from desire but from necessity. By maintaining that deception, Luigia hoped to protect them from the harsh reality of the sacrifices she believed she had to make in order to secure their future. Every ordinary interaction during the day depended upon preserving that illusion. As evening approached, the familiar transition began once again. Luigia became Antonella. The change was not merely a different name. It represented a movement between two entirely separate worlds that rarely intersected. During daylight hours, she belonged to the private sphere of family life. At night, she entered the historic center of Genoa, where narrow medieval streets concealed businesses, apartments, and rented rooms occupied by people whose lives often remained invisible to the rest of the city. Among those rooms was the small apartment at 64 Vico degli Induratori that she rented to receive clients. By all available accounts, this had become a regular part of her working routine. There was nothing to indicate that the evening itself would differ from previous nights. At some point after arriving at the rented room, Luigia met with a male client. This remains one of the few established facts about her final hours. Investigators determined that she had received a man in the room before her death. Beyond that, however, certainty rapidly disappears. No verified eyewitness observed what happened once the door closed. No known recording documented the encounter. No reliable account exists describing the conversations that may have taken place between Luigia and the individual who entered the room. Responsible reconstruction of the case, therefore, requires acknowledging the limits of what is actually known. Investigators could establish that a client had been present. They could not reconstruct every minute of the interaction that followed. This distinction is important because many notorious criminal cases become surrounded by speculation. Over time, in reality, the historical record often contains significant gaps that can never be completely filled. One of the most striking aspects of the murder is the apparent absence of any alarm that might have drawn immediate attention. According to the available information, no one reported hearing screams or cries for help coming from the room during the attack. Whether the surrounding environment prevented neighbors from noticing unusual sounds, whether the attack unfolded too quickly, or whether other circumstances contributed to the silence cannot be established from the evidence provided. The fact remains that no documented witness came forward to say they had heard Luigia calling for assistance. This absence deprived investigators of one of the most valuable forms of evidence available in homicide investigations: contemporaneous observations from nearby witnesses. Instead, detectives would later be forced to reconstruct events almost entirely through physical evidence left inside the room. Sometime during that encounter, the situation turned violently fatal. The precise sequence of the assault cannot be established in complete detail, but the physical evidence documented by investigators revealed a level of violence that immediately distinguished the case from many other homicides. Luigia was first subjected to a severe physical assault. Among the objects identified as having been used during the attack was a stool. Rather than serving as a simple piece of furniture inside the room, it became an instrument of violence. Investigators concluded that she had been beaten with it before the attack escalated even further. The use of an object already present at the location suggested that at least part of the assault involved whatever means were immediately available inside the room. Yet the violence did not end there. According to investigators, even after Luigia had suffered devastating injuries, the assault continued. The offender used a Black & Decker electric drill, directing repeated attacks toward her neck and other vital areas. The brutality of this stage of the assault profoundly affected those responsible for documenting the crime scene. Experienced investigators later described the homicide as an example of overkill, a criminological term used when the amount of violence inflicted greatly exceeds what would ordinarily be necessary to cause death. Importantly, the term describes the observable level of force rather than establishing motive. It does not, by itself, prove why an offender acted with such intensity. Instead, it reflects the objective reality that the injuries demonstrated repeated and extreme violence. The distinction mattered because investigators remained careful not to attribute psychological motives that could not be supported by evidence. While specialists noted that the attack appeared unusually violent, they stopped short of claiming certainty regarding the offender's emotional state. The physical evidence spoke clearly about what had happened. It remained less definitive about why it had happened in precisely that manner. One detail would become permanently associated with the murder. When police eventually entered the room, the drill bit remained lodged in Luigia's neck. It was an image that investigators would never forget and one that later came to define public understanding of the case. Italian media eventually adopted the phrase delitto del trapano, the drill murder, reflecting the extraordinary nature of the weapon used during the homicide. Yet reducing the crime solely to that shocking detail risks overlooking the broader reality of the attack. The drill was not the only weapon involved, nor was the homicide a single instantaneous act of violence. Instead, the evidence indicated a prolonged assault involving multiple forms of physical attack before the fatal injuries were inflicted. The scene presented investigators with numerous questions, but remarkably few immediate answers. After the attack concluded, the offender left the room. According to investigators, Luigia's wallet, containing the money she had earned that day, was missing. This fact immediately introduced robbery as one possible motive. Financial theft could explain why the wallet disappeared. However, the severity of the violence complicated that explanation. Detectives recognized that while robbery might account for the missing money, it did not necessarily explain the extraordinary brutality inflicted upon the victim. The investigation, therefore, remained open to multiple possibilities from its earliest stages. Rather than settling quickly upon a single theory, detectives understood that the available evidence required broader consideration. Sometime later, concern began to grow when Luigia failed to return home. Her family, unaware of the true nature of her nighttime work, could not immediately understand why she had not come back. Eventually, the absence became serious enough to prompt alarm. The subsequent discovery of her body transformed a family's growing worry into a homicide investigation that would dominate investigators' attention for years. When police entered the rented room, they encountered not merely the death of a woman, but one of the most disturbing crime scenes many of them had ever examined. Every homicide scene requires careful documentation before investigators can begin answering fundamental questions. Photographs must be taken. Evidence must be preserved. Biological material must be collected. Objects inside the room must be examined in their original positions before anything is disturbed. The process is meticulous because every overlooked detail represents information that may never be recovered. In Luigi's case, this careful documentation would prove invaluable decades later. At the time, investigators could not know that biological evidence preserved in 1995 would eventually become the key to identifying a suspect nearly 30 years afterward. Their responsibility was simply to collect and preserve everything that modern forensic practice required. That diligence would ultimately become one of the investigation's greatest strengths. Yet in the immediate aftermath of the murder, none of those future developments were visible. Detectives faced a profoundly difficult task. There were no confirmed eyewitnesses to the killing. There was no immediate confession. Multiple potential motives remained plausible. Luigia herself had lived two separate lives, meaning investigators needed to reconstruct relationships and encounters that even members of her own family had never known existed. The hidden identity she had created to protect her children now complicated nearly every aspect of the investigation. Detectives would have to understand both Luigia, the devoted mother, and Antonella, the woman known within Genoa's nighttime economy. Only by reconstructing both worlds could they hope to identify the person responsible for ending her life. As dawn broke over Genoa on September 6, 1995, investigators were already confronting a case that appeared unusually complex. The extraordinary brutality of the attack guaranteed public attention. The hidden aspects of the victim's life expanded the number of possible investigative directions. The lack of immediate answers ensured that speculation would soon begin to circulate. But amid growing media interest and public shock, the central challenge remained unchanged. Somewhere beyond the walls of that small room at Vico degli Induratori was the person responsible for one of Italy's most violent homicides. Identifying that individual would prove far more difficult than anyone standing at the crime scene could possibly have imagined. What initially appeared to be the beginning of a major murder investigation would gradually evolve into one of Italy's longest and most haunting cold cases, with answers remaining hidden not for weeks or months, but for nearly 3 decades. The discovery of Luigi Borelli's body marked the beginning of an investigation that would test the patience, judgment, and persistence of Italian investigators for nearly 3 decades. From the very first hours, detectives understood they were confronting a crime that resisted simple explanations. Homicide investigations often begin by asking a straightforward series of questions. Who was the victim? Who had the opportunity? What was the motive? What evidence connected a suspect to the scene? In this case, however, Almost every answer immediately produced new uncertainties. Luigi's carefully concealed double life meant that investigators first had to understand a world that even her own family did not know existed. Only then could they begin identifying the people who had crossed her path during the final years of her life. The challenge was enormous because the woman known to her children and neighbors was not the same woman known by the clients, acquaintances, and other individuals who encountered her under the name Antonella. Detectives were effectively investigating two separate biographies that belonged to the same person. The earliest phase of the investigation focused on reconstructing Luigi's final known movements and identifying every possible individual who might have entered the rented room at 64 Vico degli Induratori, since there were no confirmed eyewitnesses to the murder itself. Investigators relied heavily on the physical evidence recovered at the scene and on interviews with people who had known Luigia in either of her two lives. They examined her personal history, financial circumstances, work routine, and relationships, searching for anything capable of explaining why someone had attacked her with such extraordinary violence. Yet the crime scene itself complicated those efforts. The missing wallet suggested one possible direction, while the extreme brutality suggested another. Rather than pointing investigators toward a single obvious motive, the evidence appeared to support several competing theories simultaneously. One of the first possibilities examined was the most immediate and perhaps the most obvious. Because Luigia had been working as a sex worker under the name Antonella, detectives considered whether the killer had been one of her clients. According to the established facts, she had received a male client on the evening of September 5th. This made the final customer an individual of immediate investigative interest. In crimes involving private encounters between two people, the last known companion naturally becomes someone investigators seek to identify and eliminate or implicate through evidence. Detectives therefore explored the possibility that an interaction which began as an ordinary commercial meeting had somehow escalated into lethal violence. However, while this theory appeared plausible, establishing precisely who the client was and what occurred during the encounter proved exceptionally difficult. Without eyewitnesses or confession, investigators could not simply assume that every client represented the offender. The evidence had to support any conclusion they reached. At the same time, detectives also considered robbery as a possible motive. Luigi's wallet, containing the money she had earned that day, had disappeared from the room. Theft is a familiar motive in homicide investigations, particularly when victims are known to be carrying cash. Because Luigia received payment directly from clients, investigators recognized that she might have been perceived as carrying money at the end of her working day. The disappearance of the wallet, therefore, supported the possibility that financial gain had motivated the offender. Yet detectives remained cautious. While robbery could explain the missing money, it did not automatically explain the extraordinary level of violence inflicted upon the victim. Experienced investigators frequently distinguish between what appears to be the objective of a crime and the manner in which it is committed. Here, the assault had gone far beyond what would ordinarily be necessary to steal a wallet. This discrepancy led many investigators to question whether robbery alone could fully account for the attack. The brutality remained one of the investigation's most troubling features, raising the possibility that multiple motives, or a motive not immediately apparent, might have existed. Another avenue of investigation involved Luigi's financial history. Her decision to enter sex work had been driven by overwhelming debt following the collapse of her husband's business and his death in 1990. Detectives therefore examined whether the loan sharks connected to those debts might somehow have been involved. Illegal lending operations are frequently associated with intimidation and violence. and investigators could not ignore the possibility that financial disputes had escalated into murder. However, according to the available information, no evidence ultimately established that the creditors were responsible for Luigi's death. Nevertheless, the theory remained one of several explored during the early investigation because her financial circumstances had played such a central role in shaping the final years of her life. Detectives also examined the competitive environment in which Luigi worked. Investigators learned that she attracted a relatively large number of clients, allowing her to earn sufficient income to support her children and repay debts. Success within that environment reportedly generated jealousy among other women working in the same area. Competition for customers could create tensions, disagreements, and resentment. As a result, investigators considered whether conflict within the local prostitution scene might have contributed to the homicide. Yet once again, suspicion alone was insufficient. Although jealousy represented a conceivable motive, detectives required evidence capable of connecting any individual directly to the crime. Without such evidence, the theory remained only one possibility among many. Investigators also widened their search beyond Luigi's work, considering whether someone from her earlier life might have had reason to harm her. Because she had spent years as a nurse, maintained family relationships, and lived two distinct lives under separate identities, detectives attempted to identify anyone with a possible connection to either side of her existence. Homicide investigations routinely require detectives to avoid becoming overly committed to a single explanation too early. Every credible lead deserves examination until evidence either supports or eliminates it. In Luigi's case, the investigation therefore expanded in multiple directions simultaneously. Each new interview document and forensic examination offered the possibility of revealing the missing piece capable of explaining the murder. Unfortunately, none produced the decisive breakthrough investigators desperately needed. As weeks became months, the inquiry gradually encountered one of the greatest difficulties faced by homicide detectives everywhere: the absence of conclusive evidence pointing toward a single suspect. Numerous possibilities had been examined. None could be proven. Time itself became an increasingly significant obstacle. Memories faded. Witnesses became less certain about details that once seemed clear. New crimes demanded investigators' attention. Although the case remained open, the momentum that often accompanies the early stages of a homicide investigation inevitably slowed. Eventually, the murder of Luigi Borelli entered the category investigators fear most: a cold case. Becoming a cold case does not mean detectives stop caring or abandon the investigation. Rather, it reflects the reality that all immediately available investigative avenues have been exhausted without producing sufficient evidence for prosecution. Files remain open. Evidence is preserved. Periodically, investigators revisit earlier theories, hoping that advances in forensic science or newly discovered information might finally unlock the answers hidden within the existing evidence. In Luigi's case, careful preservation of biological evidence would later prove critically important, although no one could yet appreciate its future significance. During the years that followed, the story surrounding the investigation grew even more tragic as additional deaths became connected, at least chronologically, to the broader narrative of the case. One man who had been suspected during the investigation later died by suicide before he could be cleared. His death intensified public speculation surrounding the murder. For many observers, the suicide appeared mysterious and seemed to suggest hidden truths about the investigation. Yet responsible investigators distinguish speculation from verified fact. According to the available record, the man ultimately proved not to be responsible for Luigi's murder. His death, therefore, stands as a separate tragedy rather than evidence of guilt. The episode nevertheless illustrates how unresolved criminal investigations often affect not only victims and their families, but also individuals who become subjects of suspicion before evidence can conclusively establish the truth. Public opinion frequently moves faster than forensic proof, sometimes leaving irreversible consequences in its wake. Another loss followed only months after the homicide. In March 1996, Adriana Fravega, the woman who owned the room where Luigia had worked, died from an overdose of sleeping pills. Her death quickly generated additional rumors. Some members of the public wondered whether she possessed important knowledge about the murder or whether guilt over statements made during the investigation had contributed to her death. Such theories circulated because unresolved cases often encourage speculation wherever unanswered. Questions remain. However, investigators found no evidence confirming any connection between Adriana Fravega's death and the homicide itself. The available historical record makes this distinction clear. While public imagination frequently fills gaps left by uncertainty, criminal investigations require demonstrable proof rather than coincidence or conjecture. Years later, yet another tragedy struck Luigia's family. In 2014, her son died after falling from a bridge. The circumstances were investigated as a suspicious death, adding another painful chapter to a family already marked by profound loss. Although this event occurred nearly 2 decades after Luigia's murder and formed no established part of the homicide investigation itself, it underscored the enduring burden carried by families affected by violent crime. Even when criminal investigations remain active, the passage of time cannot prevent new hardships from arising. Behind every famous case are individuals whose lives continue long after media attention fades, often carrying emotional wounds that never fully heal. As the years passed, the investigation into Luigia's murder seemed increasingly likely to remain permanently unresolved. Yet, unlike earlier generations of detectives, modern investigators possessed one advantage unavailable in 1995: rapidly advancing forensic technology. Biological evidence collected decades earlier could now be examined using techniques that did not exist when a murder occurred. Across many countries, cold cases once considered unsolvable began yielding new answers because preserved DNA evidence could finally reveal information previously hidden. The possibility that science might eventually succeed where traditional investigation had failed remained one reason detectives continued preserving evidence with extraordinary care. An unexpected development emerged in 2022 when an Italian television program dedicated to unsolved crimes revisited Luigia Borelli's case. Public broadcasts of cold cases sometimes encourage witnesses or members of the public to share information they had never previously reported. Following the program, a woman contacted investigators with a recollection connected to her late mother, who had also worked as a nurse. According to her account, her mother had once mentioned seeing a hospital department chief shortly after the murder with noticeable scratches on his face and neck. The observation immediately attracted investigators' attention because injuries of that nature can occur during violent struggles. Although the information surfaced decades after the crime, detectives recognized that every credible lead deserved careful examination regardless of how much time had passed. The reported observation prompted prosecutors in Genoa to reopen aspects of the investigation in 2023. By then, however, the doctor in question had already died in 2021. Modern forensic science, nevertheless, provided investigators with another opportunity unavailable. During earlier decades, DNA comparisons could sometimes be performed through biological samples obtained from close relatives when direct testing was impossible. Detectives therefore arranged for genetic comparison using the doctor's family members. If the biological evidence recovered from the crime scene matched his genetic profile, investigators would finally possess an extraordinarily significant lead. Instead, The results demonstrated the opposite. The DNA did not match. The theory was eliminated. While disappointing, this outcome reflected an important principle of responsible criminal investigation. Scientific testing is valuable not only because it identifies suspects, but also because it excludes innocent individuals. Eliminating incorrect theories narrows the search and prevents investigations from drifting indefinitely toward unsupported conclusions. The reopening, therefore, strengthened the investigation, even though it failed to identify the killer. Then, in September 2024, nearly 29 years after Luigi Borelli's death, investigators announced the breakthrough they had sought since 1995. Advances in forensic DNA analysis applied to biological evidence preserved from the original crime. Scene identified a new primary suspect. According to investigators, the individual was a man from Genoa, approximately 60 years old, employed at an auto body repair workshop. Authorities allege that he had engaged in sexual activity with Luigia before murdering her and stealing the wallet containing the money she had earned that day. The announcement represented the most significant development in the investigation since the homicide itself. It demonstrated the extraordinary value of preserving forensic evidence across decades, even when immediate analysis fails to identify an offender. What investigators could not establish with available technology in 1995 became possible almost 30 years later because science had continued advancing while the evidence remained carefully protected. The breakthrough also transformed the broader significance of Luigi Borelli's case. It became not only a story about a brutal and long unsolved murder, but also an illustration of how persistence, careful evidence preservation, and modern forensic science can revive investigations long thought destined to remain unresolved. Nearly 3 decades after Luigi walked into the rented room at Vico Degli Induratori, the evidence collected during those first painstaking hours at the crime scene finally began answering questions that had haunted investigators, her family, and the public for a generation. For almost 3 decades after the murder of Luigi Borelli, the legal dimension of the case remained defined less by courtroom proceedings than by their absence. In most homicide investigations, the path from crime scene to trial follows a recognizable sequence. Detectives identify a suspect. Prosecutors gather sufficient evidence to support formal charges. The defense challenges the prosecution's case. Witnesses testify. Forensic experts explain the scientific findings. And ultimately, a court determines guilt or innocence. In Luigi's case, however, that sequence never unfolded during the years immediately following the crime. Despite the extraordinary efforts of investigators, despite the many theories examined and discarded, and despite the intense public interest generated by the brutality of the murder, the case remained without a definitive judicial resolution for decades. The absence of a trial became one of the defining characteristics of the investigation itself. It reflected neither indifference nor lack of effort on the part of investigators. Instead, it illustrated one of the most fundamental principles of every criminal justice system governed by the rule of law. Suspicion alone is never enough. However disturbing a crime may be, however convinced investigators may become that a particular theory appears plausible, prosecutors cannot proceed to trial without evidence capable of meeting the legal standards required by the courts. Throughout the 1990s and the years that followed, detectives pursued every significant lead available to them. They examined Luigi's financial history, investigated the possibility of robbery, considered whether loan sharks might have played a role, explored tensions within the environment in which she worked, and attempted to identify clients or acquaintances who could be connected to her final hours. Each investigative direction generated questions. None produced evidence sufficiently conclusive to establish criminal responsibility beyond reasonable doubt. As a result, no verified prosecution emerged from the original investigation. This prolonged absence of formal judicial proceedings inevitably shaped public perception of the case. For Luigi's family, every passing year without answers represented another year without the opportunity to hear evidence presented openly before a court. For investigators, the inability to bring the case before a judge served as a constant reminder that important questions remained unanswered. For the broader public, the murder gradually became known not only for its shocking violence, but also for its enduring uncertainty. In many cold cases, public frustration can create pressure for investigators to reach conclusions prematurely. Yet responsible law enforcement agencies must resist that pressure. Criminal prosecutions are not built upon public expectation or emotional certainty. They require admissible evidence capable of surviving rigorous legal examination. Every forensic result must withstand independent scrutiny. Every investigative conclusion must be supported by facts rather than assumptions. Every suspect remains legally presumed innocent unless and until guilt is established through proper judicial process. These principles become especially important in cases that generate widespread attention because the desire for answers can sometimes encourage speculation beyond what the evidence actually supports. The investigation into Luigi Borelli's murder repeatedly demonstrated the importance of maintaining that distinction. Several investigative theories attracted considerable interest over the years. One man became the subject of suspicion before later being excluded from responsibility. His subsequent death by suicide added another layer of tragedy to the broader narrative surrounding the case, but did not transform suspicion into proof. Likewise, when a new witness account prompted investigators to re-examine a hospital department chief decades after the crime, modern DNA testing provided an objective answer. The genetic comparison did not support the theory. Rather than attempting to preserve a compelling narrative despite contradictory evidence, investigators accepted the scientific result and eliminated that lead. This willingness to abandon theories when evidence disproves them is one of the defining characteristics of professional criminal investigation. The objective is not to confirm prior assumptions, but to discover the truth, even when that truth requires abandoning ideas that initially appeared convincing. The reopening of the case in 2023 demonstrated precisely this commitment. Prosecutors did not reopen the investigation because they wished to revive speculation. They did so because a newly reported observation, combined with modern forensic capabilities, created a legitimate opportunity to test previously unavailable evidence. Once the DNA comparison excluded the individual under consideration, the investigation moved forward rather than attempting to force the facts into an unsupported conclusion. The most significant legal development occurred in September 2024, when investigators announced that modern DNA analysis had identified a new primary suspect. According to the information made public, advances in forensic technology allowed biological evidence preserved since 1995 to be examined with techniques unavailable during the original investigation. The resulting DNA profile allegedly identified a man from Genoa, approximately 60 years old, employed at an auto body repair workshop. Investigators further alleged that he had engaged in sexual activity with Luigia before killing her, and stealing the wallet containing the money she had earned that day. From an investigative perspective, this represented the most important breakthrough since the murder itself. From a legal perspective, however, it represented the beginning of a new phase rather than its conclusion. DNA evidence is among the most powerful tools available in modern criminal justice. But even highly persuasive forensic evidence must be examined within the broader context of a judicial process. Courts do not evaluate biological evidence in isolation. Instead, they consider how the evidence was collected, preserved, analyzed, interpreted, and connected to the alleged criminal conduct. The integrity of the chain of custody, the reliability of laboratory procedures, and the opportunity for independent review all form essential components of due process. Consequently, the announcement of a DNA-based suspect did not itself constitute a judicial determination of guilt. It represented an investigative finding that required further legal evaluation. Based strictly on the factual information provided for this script, no verified trial, conviction, acquittal, sentencing, or final judicial verdict has been reported. That limitation is significant because true crime storytelling carries an important ethical responsibility. It is tempting to complete unresolved narratives by assuming what must have happened after. Investigators identify a suspect, yet doing so would blur the distinction between established fact and speculation. Accuracy requires acknowledging when the historical record remains incomplete. Therefore, this account does not describe courtroom testimony, cross-examinations, prosecutorial arguments, defense strategies, judicial rulings, or sentencing proceedings, because such information is not contained within the verified material on which this script is based. Rather than weakening the story, this absence highlights the unusual nature of the case itself. Nearly 30 years after Luigi's death, science succeeded in producing a breakthrough that investigators had sought since 1995. Yet the principles of justice demand that every investigative breakthrough be examined through appropriate legal procedures before it becomes a judicial conclusion. This distinction protects not only the rights of suspects, but also the integrity of the justice system itself. Criminal convictions carry enormous consequences. They must therefore rest upon evidence tested openly and fairly within the legal process rather than upon assumptions formed outside the courtroom. In many respects, the legal history of the Luigi Borelli investigation illustrates the delicate balance between persistence and restraint. Investigators demonstrated persistence by refusing to abandon the case despite decades without resolution. They preserved evidence with extraordinary care, revisited old files when new information emerged, embraced advances in forensic science, and remained willing to reconsider earlier conclusions. At the same time, they demonstrated restraint by declining to pursue unsupported accusations, eliminating theories contradicted by DNA evidence, and allowing scientific findings rather than public pressure to guide the investigation. These two qualities, persistence and restraint, often determine whether a cold case ultimately moves toward justice or becomes overwhelmed by speculation. The events of September 2024, therefore, stand not as the conclusion of a courtroom drama, but as the culmination of nearly 3 decades of investigative work. They represent the moment when biological evidence collected in a small rented room in Genoa finally yielded information that had remained hidden since the night of September 5, 1995. Whether that evidence ultimately results in a completed judicial process lies beyond the verified scope of the material presented here. What can be stated with confidence is that the investigation reached its most significant milestone through the careful preservation of forensic evidence and the remarkable evolution of DNA science. In a case where witnesses could not fully explain what happened, where memories inevitably faded with time, and where numerous investigative theories failed to produce definitive answers. It was the silent testimony preserved within biological traces that eventually offered investigators their strongest lead. The legal chapter of Luigi Borelli's story, therefore, remains closely intertwined with one of the central lessons of modern criminal justice. Evidence can endure long after people, memories, and opportunities have disappeared, and when preserved with care, It may continue speaking on behalf of a victim even decades after a crime has been committed. Nearly 3 decades separate the morning Luigi Borelli was last seen alive from the moment modern. Forensic science produced the investigation's most significant breakthrough. During those years, the city of Genoa changed. New generations grew up. Technology transformed nearly every aspect of daily life. Investigators retired, new detectives inherited old files, and public attention shifted toward newer tragedies. Yet one thing remained remarkably constant. The questions surrounding Luigi's death never completely disappeared. Her case continued to occupy a unique place within Italian criminal history because it represented far more than an exceptionally violent homicide. It became a story about hidden lives, economic desperation, institutional perseverance, and the extraordinary ability of scientific progress to give forgotten evidence a second chance to speak. When people remember the murder today, they often remember the horrifying nature of the crime scene first. The description of the attack understandably left a profound impression on investigators and the public alike. However, reducing Luigia Borelli's story solely to the brutality of her death risks overlooking the person she had been for decades before that final evening in September 1995. She was not defined by the violence that ended her life. She had spent years building a career as a nurse, dedicating herself to caring for others through one of the most demanding professions in medicine. She was also a wife who believed she was helping to build a future with her husband and a mother, raising 2 children. Those roles occupied far more of her life than the final chapter that eventually came to dominate. Newspaper headlines, remembering her only as the victim of the so-called Darrell murder, would obscure the much larger human story that preceded the crime. One of the most significant lessons emerging from Luigi's life concerns the devastating impact that financial catastrophe can have on ordinary families. According to the available historical record, her decision to enter sex work did not arise from ambition or personal preference. Instead, it followed the collapse of her husband's business. The burden of approximately 250 million lire in debt owed to loan sharks, and his sudden death from a heart attack in 1990. Those events fundamentally altered the direction of her life. Left alone to support 2 children while confronting overwhelming financial obligations, she ultimately chose a path she believed would allow her to provide for her family. It is impossible to know the emotional burden carried by someone forced to maintain 2 entirely separate identities for years. Every day required protecting her children from a truth she feared would hurt them. Every evening required entering a dangerous environment while hoping to return safely before morning. Every explanation offered to family members demanded consistency because discovery would have destroyed the fragile boundary separating her 2 lives. The available evidence indicates that she maintained this balance for approximately 3 years. It also suggests that she succeeded in using her earnings to support her children and gradually address the debts threatening the family's future. Her determination demonstrates not only resilience, but also the difficult choices that financial desperation can impose upon individuals who see few realistic alternatives. The case also exposes the particular vulnerability faced by people working in marginalized occupations. Investigators often encounter additional challenges when victims belong to communities affected by social stigma, hidden identities, incomplete records of daily activities, reluctance among potential witnesses to cooperate, and assumptions made by the public can all complicate efforts to establish the truth. In Luigi's case, detectives first had to reconstruct a life that had been deliberately concealed even from those closest to her. Her family knew the devoted mother. Her clients knew Antonella. Investigators alone were tasked with understanding both identities simultaneously. That complexity undoubtedly contributed to the extraordinary difficulty of the investigation. It also serves as a reminder that every victim deserves the same commitment to justice regardless of occupation, social status, or personal circumstances. Criminal investigations cannot distinguish between lives considered more or less worthy of protection. Every homicide represents the loss of a human being whose story deserves to be understood with accuracy, dignity, and compassion. Another enduring lesson concerns the importance of preserving evidence even when immediate answers remain unavailable. When investigators documented the crime scene in September 1995, they could not have anticipated the remarkable advances in forensic DNA analysis that would emerge over the following decades. They simply performed their responsibilities according to the best scientific standards available at the time, collecting biological material and preserving it carefully for future examination. That decision ultimately became one of the most important factors in the investigation's eventual breakthrough. Across the world, numerous cold cases have been reopened because evidence once considered insufficient acquired new significance through technological innovation. Luigi Borelli's murder stands among those cases demonstrating that careful evidence preservation is not merely an administrative procedure, but a long-term investment in the possibility of future justice. Science evolves. Evidence, when protected properly, remains capable of benefiting from those advances regardless of how much time has passed. Equally important is the way the investigation illustrates the discipline required of professional investigators confronting uncertainty. Throughout nearly 3 decades, detectives explored multiple theories. They considered robbery because Luigi's wallet had disappeared. They examined the possibility that loan sharks might have been involved because of her financial history. They investigated tensions arising from competition within the environment in which she worked. They pursued leads involving former acquaintances and clients. Later, after a television program renewed public attention, they carefully examined the allegation concerning a hospital department chief who had reportedly been seen with scratches shortly after the murder. Rather than accepting that allegation as truth simply because it sounded plausible, investigators tested it scientifically. DNA comparison excluded the individual from suspicion. This willingness to follow evidence wherever it leads, even when it disproves an attractive theory, is one of the defining characteristics of responsible criminal investigation. Justice depends not upon confirming expectations, but upon allowing facts to determine conclusions. The eventual identification of a suspect through modern DNA analysis in 2024 therefore represents more than a forensic achievement. It demonstrates the cumulative value of decades of patient investigative work. Every officer who preserved evidence, every technician who maintained forensic records, every prosecutor who kept the case active, and every scientist who advanced DNA technology contributed directly or indirectly to that moment. Cold cases are rarely solved through a single dramatic discovery. More often, they are resolved because countless individuals across many years continue performing careful, often unnoticed work despite long periods without visible progress. Luigi's case reflects precisely that kind of institutional persistence. Yet the story also reminds us that time extracts a heavy price, even when investigations eventually advance. During the decades separating the crime from the DNA breakthrough, additional tragedies touched those connected to the case. A man once suspected of involvement died by suicide before later being excluded from responsibility. Adriana Fravega, who owned the room where Luigi worked, died from a sleeping pill overdose only months after the murder, giving rise to speculation that investigators could never substantiate with evidence. Years later, Luigi's own son died after falling from a bridge in circumstances investigated as suspicious. Although none of these events resolved the homicide itself, together they illustrate how the consequences of violent crime often extend far beyond the immediate victim. Families continue living with uncertainty. Communities continue asking unanswered questions. Lives continue unfolding beneath the long shadow cast by an unresolved investigation. One of the most powerful aspects of Luigia Borelli's story lies in its challenge to simplistic judgments. It would be easy to view her only through the circumstances of her final years, overlooking everything that came before. Yet the available facts tell a more complex story. She had once been a nurse caring for patients. She became a widow unexpectedly burdened by enormous debt. She made difficult choices in an effort to protect her children from financial ruin. She carefully concealed the sacrifices she believed were necessary because she wanted her family to retain a sense of normality. Whether one examines her story from the perspective of social history, criminal justice, or human resilience, it resists easy categorization. It reminds us that many lives affected by violent crime are shaped long before the crime itself occurs by economic pressures, personal loss, and responsibilities invisible to outsiders. There is another reason why the murder of Luigia Borelli continues to resonate decades later. It demonstrates the remarkable dialogue between memory and science. Human memory inevitably weakens over time. Witnesses forget details. Investigators retire. Newspapers disappear into archives. Buildings change ownership. Entire neighborhoods evolve. Biological evidence, however, follows different rules. Properly preserved, it retains information unaffected by fading recollection or passing generations. In this case, scientific analysis succeeded where memory alone could not. The evidence recovered in 1995 remained silent for years, yet it never ceased existing. When technology finally became capable of asking more sophisticated questions, the evidence responded. This reality has transformed modern criminal investigation across the world and offers hope in countless unresolved cases where careful preservation may one day allow forgotten traces to reveal new answers. Ultimately, however, the legacy of Luigia Borelli should not rest solely upon forensic science or investigative perseverance. It should also rest upon recognition of her humanity. Before she became the subject of police files, television documentaries, and newspaper articles, she lived an ordinary life marked by work, family, responsibility, and sacrifice. She experienced love, loss, hope, and fear long before violence entered her story. Remembering those dimensions honors the individual behind the case file. It reminds us that every homicide investigation begins with a life that possessed meaning, independent of the crime that ended it. As this story comes to a close, it returns to where it began. An ordinary morning in Genoa on September 5, 1995. Luigia Borelli sat down for breakfast near her home, unaware that it would be the final ordinary moment of her life. There were no signs announcing that history was about to remember her name. There was only another day, another routine, another effort to provide for the family she loved. By the following morning, that ordinary life had been transformed into one of Italy's most haunting criminal investigations. For nearly 30 years, the silence surrounding her final hours seemed almost impossible to overcome. Yet the careful preservation of evidence, combined with relentless investigative commitment and the continuing evolution of forensic science, eventually demonstrated that even the oldest unanswered questions need not remain unanswered forever. Whether measured through compassion for a mother struggling against overwhelming hardship, admiration for investigators who refuse to abandon a difficult case, or appreciation for the scientific advances that changed the course of modern criminal justice, The story of Luigia Borelli endures as a powerful reminder that truth may sometimes require extraordinary patience. Decades may pass, memories may fade, people may disappear. But when evidence is preserved and justice continues to seek answers with integrity rather than haste, even the quietest voice left behind can, one day, be heard again. For nearly 30 years, the murder of Luigia Borelli existed in a space that is painfully familiar to many families affected by unsolved violent crime. It was neither completely forgotten nor truly resolved. Instead, it remained suspended between memory and uncertainty, revisited whenever advances in forensic science inspired renewed hope or when journalists returned to examine Italy's most enduring cold cases. The passage of time did not lessen the significance of what had happened inside the small rented room atti vico degli indoratori. If anything, the decades emphasized how profoundly a single act of violence can continue shaping lives long after newspaper headlines disappear. Behind every archived police report and every preserved piece of evidence stood a woman whose life had been defined not by notoriety, but by responsibility, sacrifice, and an unwavering determination to protect her family under circumstances few people ever experience. Looking back at Luigia Borelli's story as a whole, one of its most striking features is the extraordinary contrast between the ordinary and the extraordinary. She did not begin her adult life expecting to become part of Italian criminal history. She trained as a nurse, entered a respected profession, married, and raised 2 children. Her ambitions appear to have reflected the aspirations shared by countless families: stable work, financial security, and a better future for the next generation. The dramatic turn in her life did not arise from reckless behavior or a sudden desire for a different lifestyle. Instead, it emerged through a sequence of events that gradually narrowed her choices. A failed family business, overwhelming debt, the sudden death of her husband, and the relentless pressure of loan sharks created circumstances that forced her into decisions she had likely never imagined making. The tragedy of Luigia's life, therefore, began long before the night she was murdered. It began with economic collapse, personal loss, and the burden of carrying responsibilities alone. Her hidden identity as Antonella became one of the most poignant aspects of the case because it reflected both courage and isolation. Every evening, she stepped into a world that her children knew nothing about. Every morning, she returned home, determined to preserve the image of an ordinary mother providing for her family. The deception was not maintained for personal gain or excitement, but as an act of protection. She wanted her children to continue believing that their mother spent her days caring for an elderly woman rather than confronting the dangers associated with sex work. That decision required enormous emotional discipline. Living 2 separate lives meant constantly guarding against mistakes, accidental encounters, or questions that might expose the truth. It also meant carrying the psychological burden alone. The available historical record suggests that she succeeded in protecting her family from that reality until the day of her death. Tragically, the secret she had worked so hard to preserve became central to the investigation after she was gone. Detectives first had to discover the existence of Antonella before they could begin understanding the circumstances that led to the murder. In many ways, Luigia's story also reflects broader social realities that extend beyond a single criminal case. Financial hardship has often forced individuals into dangerous forms of work simply to support themselves or those who depend upon them. While every person's circumstances are unique, Luigia's experience illustrates how quickly stability can disappear after a series of devastating setbacks. One unexpected business failure became overwhelming debt. Debt became constant pressure. Pressure became impossible choices. Those choices eventually placed her in an environment where she became vulnerable to extraordinary Violence. None of this diminishes the responsibility of the individual accused of committing the crime. Responsibility for murder always rests with the perpetrator. Yet understanding the social circumstances surrounding the victim helps explain why the case continues to resonate far beyond the details of the homicide itself. It reminds us that victims often arrive at the final moments of their lives carrying burdens invisible to everyone except themselves. Another enduring lesson from the case concerns the remarkable evolution of forensic science. When investigators entered the crime scene in September 1995, they collected and preserved biological evidence according to the best available standards of the time. They could not know that nearly 30 years later, entirely new methods of DNA analysis would transform the value of those same samples. The evidence remained unchanged, but humanity's ability to interpret it evolved dramatically. This reality has fundamentally altered modern criminal investigation. Across the world, countless cold cases have been revisited because advances in forensic genetics allow investigators to obtain information that earlier generations could never access. Luigia Borelli's case stands as one of Italy's most striking examples of that transformation. The DNA breakthrough announced in 2024 did not erase the decades of uncertainty experienced by her family, nor could it undo the suffering caused by the murder itself. What it demonstrated was something equally significant. Careful evidence preservation can allow justice to continue pursuing answers long after conventional investigative methods appear exhausted. Time, once regarded primarily as an enemy of criminal investigations, can sometimes become an unexpected ally when science advances more rapidly than evidence deteriorates. The investigation also illustrates the importance of intellectual honesty within criminal justice. Throughout the years, detectives examined numerous theories. They considered robbery because Luigi's earnings had disappeared. They explored possible connections to loan sharks because of her financial history. They investigated rivalry within the local prostitution environment because evidence suggested she attracted many clients. They reopened the case after a television program prompted a new witness to report information concerning a hospital department chief who allegedly appeared with scratches shortly after the murder. Each lead was taken seriously because each possessed at least some potential relevance. Yet investigators also demonstrated the discipline required to abandon theories once scientific evidence disproved them. When DNA excluded the doctor as a suspect, that hypothesis was set aside despite the attention it had generated. This commitment to following evidence rather than emotion remains one of the defining strengths of professional criminal investigation. The objective was never simply to identify someone who appeared suspicious. The objective was to identify the individual whom the evidence actually connected to the crime. Cold cases often become surrounded by rumor, coincidence, and speculation. Luigi's investigation serves as a reminder that genuine progress depends upon distinguishing verified fact from compelling narrative. For the family of Luigi Borelli, however, no scientific breakthrough can entirely erase the human cost of nearly 3 decades without answers. The murder itself was only the beginning of a long period marked by uncertainty and additional tragedy. The death of Luigi's son in 2014 added another painful chapter to a family already devastated by violence. Although investigated separately as a suspicious death, it underscored how suffering rarely exists in isolation. Families affected by homicide continue living long after media attention fades, often carrying grief that evolves but never entirely disappears. Every anniversary becomes another reminder of unanswered questions. Every new development revives hope while also reopening emotional wounds. Behind every cold case exists not merely an investigative challenge, but a continuing human experience shaped by absence. memory, and resilience. The broader legacy of Luigia Borelli, therefore, extends beyond forensic science or criminal procedure. It invites reflection on the value of empathy when discussing true crime. Public fascination with notorious murders often centers on the offender, the brutality of the act, or the mystery surrounding the investigation. Yet stories such as this one encourage a different perspective. They remind us that the victim possessed a full life before becoming part of a police investigation. Luigia was a daughter, a wife, a mother, and a nurse before she ever became known as the victim of the Darrell murder. Remembering those aspects of her life restores dignity that sensational headlines sometimes overshadow. It also changes the way the story is understood. Rather than becoming merely another infamous homicide, it becomes the story of an ordinary woman whose determination to protect her children ultimately placed her in circumstances from which she never returned. Perhaps the most powerful image with which to leave this case is not the horrific crime scene that investigators encountered on September 6, 1995. Instead, it is the far quieter image recorded the day before. A woman sits down for breakfast at a cafe near her home. To everyone around her, she appears entirely ordinary. No one watching could know they were witnessing the final ordinary morning of her life. She finishes breakfast, continues with her routine, and carries the responsibilities that had defined her existence for years. Somewhere ahead lies an encounter that will forever alter the lives of her family and challenge investigators for nearly 30 years. Yet in that moment, none of it is visible. There is only another day, another attempt to earn enough money to support 2 children, and another quiet effort to keep painful truths hidden from those she loved most. That ordinary morning stands in profound contrast to everything that followed, reminding us how suddenly violence can interrupt even the most familiar routines. Today, the story of Luigia Borelli endures because it combines 2 realities that rarely appear together with such clarity. On one hand, it reveals the devastating consequences of desperation, vulnerability, and extreme violence. On the other, it demonstrates the extraordinary resilience of justice when supported by patience, scientific progress, and careful preservation of evidence. Although decades separated the crime from its most significant investigative breakthrough, the case ultimately affirmed an important principle that extends far beyond Italy itself. Truth does not always emerge quickly. Sometimes it survives quietly within evidence stored in an archive, waiting for future generations to develop the tools necessary to hear what it has always contained. In that sense, Luigia Borelli's story is not only about a murder committed in Genoa in 1995. It is also about the enduring belief that every victim deserves to be remembered as a person first, that every unanswered question deserves honest investigation, and that even after years of silence, the pursuit of justice remains worthwhile. That legacy, perhaps more than any single forensic discovery, ensures that Luigia Borelli's name will continue to be remembered, not simply because of the brutality of her death, but because her life, her struggles, and the long search for truth continue to speak across the decades. 3 decades is a long time in the life of a nation, yet it is remarkably short in the life of an unanswered question. Between the night of September 5, 1995, and the DNA breakthrough announced in 2024, Italy witnessed profound political, technological, and social change. The city of Genoa continued to evolve, generations grew older, and entire careers in law enforcement began and ended. Yet somewhere inside an evidence archive, carefully preserved biological samples remained untouched by the passage of time. They carried no memories, expressed no emotions, and made no demands. They simply waited. In many ways, That silent waiting mirrors the experience of countless families whose loved ones become victims of unsolved violent crime. Life continues because it must. Birthdays are celebrated, children become adults, homes change, jobs come and go, and society moves forward. But beneath those ordinary rhythms remains an absence that never entirely disappears. Questions that have no answers become part of everyday existence. Every anniversary revives memories. Every news report about advances in forensic science brings a renewed, cautious hope that perhaps this time something will change. For Luigia Borelli's family, the years following her murder were undoubtedly measured not only by calendars but by uncertainty. While the public remembered one of Italy's most brutal homicides, those closest to her remembered something much more personal: the absence of a mother, the disappearance of a familiar voice, and the loss of someone whose daily routines had once formed the center of family life. Cases such as Luigi's challenge society to think carefully about how victims are remembered. True crime has become one of the world's most popular forms of storytelling. Millions of people watch documentaries, listen to podcasts, and read investigative books seeking to understand how extraordinary crimes occurred. Yet, every responsible account carries an ethical obligation. It must never allow the offender to become more memorable than the person whose life was taken. Violence naturally captures attention because it shocks the imagination. But a victim's humanity deserves far greater emphasis than the brutality of the crime itself. Luigia Borelli should not be remembered solely because an offender used extraordinary violence against her. She should also be remembered because she spent years caring for hospital patients as a nurse, because she raised 2 children, because she attempted to rebuild her family's future after devastating financial collapse, and because she continued placing her children's needs ahead of her own despite overwhelming personal hardship. Those qualities existed long before the murder and deserve equal space within her story. The facts available about Luigi's life reveal an individual who repeatedly responded to adversity with responsibility rather than surrender. After the failure of her husband's business and his sudden death in 1990, she inherited not only grief but also crushing financial obligations. Approximately 250 million lire in debt represented more than an accounting figure. It represented constant pressure, uncertainty, and fear for the future. According to the established historical record, she eventually entered sex work under the name Antonella because she believed it offered the only realistic opportunity to support her children while repaying the debts left behind. Whether viewed from the perspective of economics, sociology, or criminal justice, this decision illustrates how structural hardship can reshape lives in ways outsiders often fail to appreciate. People encountering Luigia during her final years may have seen only fragments of her reality. Her children saw a caring mother. Clients knew Antonella. Former colleagues remembered a nurse. Investigators, only after her death, were forced to assemble those separate identities into a single, coherent life story. That complexity remains one of the defining characteristics of the case. Another reason the murder continues to hold significance is the example it provides for modern forensic investigation. In 1995, DNA analysis already existed, but the techniques available were far less powerful than those employed decades later. Many biological samples collected during investigations could not immediately identify offenders because laboratories lacked the sensitivity or analytical methods required to interpret them fully, rather than discarding evidence considered temporarily unhelpful. Professional investigators preserved it carefully. That decision ultimately transformed the Luigia Borelli investigation. The biological traces collected during the original crime scene examination retained their scientific value across nearly 30 years because they were stored properly. As forensic genetics advanced, evidence once regarded as inconclusive became capable of identifying a suspect. This evolution demonstrates one of the most remarkable developments in criminal justice during the modern era. Scientific progress does not merely improve future investigations, it also reaches backward, allowing older cases to benefit from discoveries that had not yet been imagined when the crimes occurred. The investigation likewise offers an important lesson about patience. Public discussions of criminal cases often emphasize dramatic breakthroughs while overlooking the years of careful work that make those breakthroughs possible. Cold case investigations rarely advance through spectacular moments alone. They progress because evidence is cataloged accurately, because documentation remains complete, because prosecutors continue reviewing unresolved files, because forensic specialists preserve biological material under appropriate conditions, and because investigators remain willing to revisit earlier conclusions whenever new information emerges. Every stage requires professionalism, even when immediate success appears unlikely. Luigi's case exemplifies that quiet persistence. Detectives considered numerous possibilities over the years, including robbery, clients, financial disputes, workplace rivalries, and other potential connections. They reopened inquiries when new witness information surfaced. They accepted scientific findings even when those findings disproved promising theories. Ultimately, the breakthrough announced in 2024 reflected not only advances in DNA technology, but also decades of disciplined investigative practice. The story further illustrates the importance of distinguishing between evidence and speculation. Unresolved crimes naturally generate rumors. Every unexplained coincidence risks becoming part of a larger narrative regardless of whether supporting evidence exists. During the years following Luigi's murder, public attention focused on several developments, including the death of a previously suspected man who later proved innocent, the death of Adriana Vega after an overdose of sleeping pills, and later tragedy affecting Luigi's own family. Each event contributed to the emotional atmosphere surrounding the case. Yet investigators consistently separated verified fact from unsupported assumption. The suicide of former suspect did not establish guilt. The death of the room's owner did not automatically reveal hidden knowledge. Later family tragedies did not retroactively explain the original homicide. Responsible criminal investigation depends upon precisely this distinction. Facts must remain independent of coincidence. Evidence must outweigh speculation. Justice requires conclusions supported by demonstrable proof rather than emotionally satisfying narratives. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the case lies in what it reveals about dignity. Throughout history, victims associated with marginalized occupations have often received less sympathy than others. Social prejudice sometimes encourages people to define individuals by the circumstances in which they died rather than by the lives they lived. Luigia Borelli's story argues against that tendency. She entered sex work because of documented financial desperation following devastating personal loss. That circumstance neither diminished her humanity nor reduced the seriousness of the crime committed against her. Every victim deserves equal commitment from investigators, equal protection under the law, and equal remembrance after death. The determination shown by Italian investigators over nearly 3 decades reflects that principle. They did not abandon the case because the victim had lived a complicated life. They continued pursuing answers because every life possesses equal value before the law. Looking back from the perspective of the present, it is striking how much of Luigi's story revolves around ordinary acts of responsibility rather than extraordinary events. She went to work. She earned money. She cared for her children. She concealed painful realities in an effort to protect those she loved. Those routines continued day after day until violence interrupted them. In many respects, that ordinary perseverance makes her story more moving than the crime itself. Countless people facing financial hardship quietly shoulder burdens unknown even to their closest family members. Many parents sacrifice personal comfort to provide stability for their children. Luigia's circumstances were unusually severe, but the instinct motivating her decisions, the desire to protect one's family, is universally recognizable. That shared humanity explains why her story continues to resonate decades later. The investigation may one day be remembered as an important forensic milestone, yet its deeper significance lies elsewhere. It reminds us that criminal cases are ultimately stories about people, not evidence. DNA profiles, investigative files, and court records matter because they serve human beings whose lives have been interrupted by violence. Science provides answers, but compassion provides meaning. Without remembering the individual at the center of the investigation, even a most remarkable forensic achievement becomes little more than a technical accomplishment. Luigia Borelli deserves to be remembered as more than a victim, more than a case file, and more than the subject of one of Italy's most famous cold cases. She deserves to be remembered as a woman who struggled against overwhelming adversity, who continued supporting her family despite impossible circumstances, and whose search for justice demonstrated the extraordinary power of persistence. As this documentary reaches its conclusion, the image that remains is not one of violence, but of continuity. Somewhere in Genoa, another morning begins much as it did on September 5, 1995. Cafes open their doors. Nurses begin their hospital shifts. Parents leave home for work hoping to provide a better future for their children. Streets fill with ordinary people whose private struggles remain invisible to those passing by. Most of those stories will never appear in history books or criminal investigations. They will simply unfold quietly, day after day. Luigia Borelli once believed her own life would continue in that ordinary way. Instead, her story became one of Italy's most enduring reminders that justice sometimes travels an extraordinarily long road. Yet even after decades of silence, careful investigation preserved evidence, and the relentless pursuit of truth demonstrated that time does not always erase the possibility of answers. Sometimes it simply postpones them until science, patience, and determination finally converge. In that sense, the legacy of Luigia Borelli extends beyond a single criminal case. It becomes a testament to the enduring belief that every victim matters. Every unanswered question deserves honest investigation, and every carefully preserved piece of evidence carries the possibility that, one day, the truth will finally emerge from silence. When a case spans nearly 3 decades, its conclusion is never a single moment. It is a gradual compression of time, memory, and evidence until what once felt distant suddenly becomes sharply defined again. In the murder of Luigia Borelli, that moment of return came not through witness testimony or courtroom drama, but through the silent language of forensic science. Biological traces collected in a small room in Genoa in 1995 eventually produced information that investigators had waited years to obtain. In that sense, the case did not so much end as it re-emerged from silence, transformed by technology that did not exist when the crime occurred. Yet, even with a significant DNA-based development announced in 2024, the broader meaning of the case extends beyond any single investigative breakthrough. What remains most important is not only what was discovered, but what the long journey of discovery reveals about justice itself. Criminal investigations are often imagined as linear processes: crime, investigation, arrest, trial, resolution. The reality, as this case demonstrates, is far more fragmented. Time interrupts. Evidence waits. People move on. And sometimes, answers arrive long after the emotional urgency that first demanded them. The murder of Luigi Borelli continues to be discussed in Italy not simply because of its brutality, but because it exposes several enduring tensions within modern society. One of those tensions is the gap between vulnerability and visibility. Luigia lived much of her final years in a state of dual existence, balancing the identity of a mother and former nurse with the concealed reality of her nighttime work under the name Antonella. That separation was not unusual in the context of economic hardship, but it illustrates how many individuals live lives that remain partially invisible even to those closest to them. When violence enters such a life, it often forces investigators to reconstruct realities that were never fully known in the first place. Another tension revealed by the case is the difference between suspicion and proof. Over the years, multiple theories emerged. Some were rooted in financial pressure, others in interpersonal dynamics, and others in isolated pieces of witness information that surfaced long after the event. Each theory reflected an attempt to impose order on a case defined by fragmentation. Yet only forensic evidence could ultimately distinguish possibility from fact. The eventual DNA breakthrough did not validate every earlier assumption, nor did it confirm the narrative that had developed in public discourse over decades. Instead, it narrowed the field of certainty to what could be scientifically demonstrated. At the same time, the case highlights the limitations of time in human investigation. Memories fade not because people are careless, but because memory itself is unstable. Witness accounts change subtly over years. Context is lost. Details that once seemed minor become irretrievable. In contrast, biological evidence remains fixed. It does not reinterpret itself or weaken in meaning. It simply waits for the tools capable of reading it correctly. This difference between human memory and physical trace evidence has become one of the defining features of modern forensic science. And Luigi Borelli's case is a clear example of that evolution. The passage of nearly 30 years also forces reflection on the emotional dimension of unresolved cases. For families, the absence of closure is not an abstract legal condition. It is a lived experience that continues across generations. Each new development reopens the possibility of resolution while also reviving the emotional weight of loss. Even when investigative progress is made, it does not erase the years spent in uncertainty. It simply alters the landscape of that uncertainty. In Luigi's case, the DNA development brought investigative clarity. But the emotional history built across decades remains part of the story. There is also a broader societal meaning embedded in this case. It reflects how justice systems evolve not only through laws and procedures, but through technology. The ability to extract meaningful results from decades-old biological material has fundamentally changed the potential lifespan of criminal investigations. Cases once considered permanently closed or unsolvable now remain active in a different form, sustained by the possibility that future scientific advances may unlock what earlier generations could not. This creates a new relationship between past and present, where unresolved crimes are no longer entirely confined to history. However, even with scientific progress, the core principle of criminal justice remains unchanged. Evidence must lead, and conclusions must be restrained by what can be proven. The integrity of an investigation depends not only on its ability to identify suspects, but also on its willingness to exclude them when evidence demands it. In this case, that principle was visible in the way alternative theories were tested and eliminated rather than preserved for narrative convenience. That discipline is often invisible in public discussions of crime, but it is essential to the legitimacy of any eventual outcome. Ultimately, what remains after examining the case of Luigi Borelli is not a single defining explanation, but a layered understanding of how fragile human life can be when placed under economic, social, and physical vulnerability, and how slowly justice sometimes moves when evidence and technology are separated by decades. Her story sits at the intersection of personal tragedy and institutional persistence, shaped equally by the circumstances of her life and the evolving capacity of forensic science to speak on behalf of the dead. As a final reflection, it is worth returning not to the crime scene, but to the ordinary morning that preceded it. Nothing about that moment suggested it would become historically significant. There was no indication that it would later be examined in police files, documentaries, or forensic reviews spanning generations. It was simply a morning in Genoa, one of countless mornings in an ordinary life shaped by responsibility and quiet endurance. The tragedy of what followed does not erase that ordinariness. Instead, it frames it with a meaning that only time could reveal. In the end, the case of Luigi Borelli is not defined solely by how her life ended, nor by how long it took to find investigative clarity. It is defined by the reminder that behind every unresolved file is a human life that once unfolded in real time, with real hopes, real obligations, and real consequences. And while science may eventually answer many of the questions left behind by violence, it is memory, careful, accurate, and respectful, that ensures those lives are not reduced to silence. That is where the story rests, between what was lost, what was discovered, and what must never be forgotten.